Well, hello everyone. Welcome to week 8 in our financial wellness boot camp. I hope you're all doing very well. You're staying safe and you're staying healthy as always. I'm glad to be back with you for lesson 8. We have some great information to share, and I know you're going to get a lot out of it. Quickly, just introduce myself again. My name is Jordan Fuller. I am a local financial professional here with Wallio. And I'm always happy to spend some time giving you guys some great information that you can use in your financial wellness journey. So you remember this gentleman here? You met him with Matt in lesson 2, Matt Michelson, our financial planner. He went over this gentleman, Warren Buffett's 2 rules of money. And just to reiterate, as far as Warren Buffett, his 2 rules of money are 1, never lose money, and 2, never forget rule number 1. I really like those 2 rules. They're easy to remember and simple to follow, right? So you need to make sure that your money, your assets, your equity, your belongings, basically everything that you've worked hard for over your life is protected for you and your family, and that you don't have a risk of losing it, right? Obviously, if you're going to work hard for something, you're going to want to be able to keep it and then designate who gets it when you're gone, right? Now, you can lose money to inflation if you keep it in a bank. We talked about that, back in lesson 2. Now, in today's lesson, we're going to go over assets and equity protection from creditors and predators. You're also going to learn what is possible, what the things you have that you could possibly lose in a lawsuit if you ever find yourself in that situation. What happens to your assets, things that have your name on it, such as like your car, a house, or even your checking account. If you were to disappear and you wouldn't be able to claim those things anymore, what would happen to those things you owned? I'm also going to get into what a will and trust is and how it works. And at the end of today's lesson, I'm going to actually tell you a story of 2 brothers side by side, both of which owned a home. Now, one of those brothers decided to take the traditional route and pay off his house as quickly as possible, whereas the second brother decided to take a different route and do something a little different. I'm also going to get into, which brother was right and why they were right. And you're going to have to wait and see, figure out which brother took the correct course of action. So you're going to have to wait to find out, see how that goes at the end of our lesson. So let's get into it. You ready? Let's go. All right. So a lot of people start this lesson with a question. Question is, do I even have assets? Do I even have equity? I mean, I'm not a rich person. Do I even have things like that? Now, the answer is yes, you do have things like that. You do have assets. Everyone has assets. But what is an asset? So an asset is something that you own that has monetary value, like a house or a car, a checking account, stocks, things like that. Now, your ability to make an income is also an asset. And then we've already covered in the previous lesson on how to protect that. But let's take a closer look at some of the most common assets that regular everyday people have. So first over here, you're going to have things like your cash and equivalents. These are the things this is money in your pocket, basically, or money you have stored in a savings account, a checking account, CD, or other account. It's basically, these are your cash assets right here. Then we get over here, and these are going to be your valuables. These are the physical objects that you can touch, right? Examples would be like your home, or, if you have a business property, a car, boat, jewelry, if you like to collect art, things like that. Those are going to be your valuables. Those are going to be that kind of asset. Then you're going to have your investments. These are going to be the non-physical assets. So this is going to include your stocks, your bonds, annuities, pensions, all the kind of things like that are accumulating cash value for you. But you don't touch them. They're not physical. Then over here, last but not least, you're going to have your equity assets. Now, when we talk about equity, the first thing that usually pops into mind is home equity, right? That's kind of the most commonly known form of equity. It's not the only form, but it's the most common. So if you have a bank account, you have an asset. If you have a house or an apartment, furniture, property, jewelry, things like that, you have assets. So I want you to be clear on that. Now, equity is also an asset. But what is it? What is equity? Let's take a look again at that most common example we talked about on the last slide, home equity. So you've probably heard that one of the biggest benefits to buying a home is that you can build equity in it, and then therefore afterwards you can tap into that equity to use for yourself and your family. So home equity is the difference between what you owe on your mortgage and what your current value of your home is. So say, for example, say you have a house, you have this house right here, and the house is worth $500,000, right? Now you take a look at your mortgage and you see that you still owe $230,000 on your mortgage, right? Then if you take this number here and subtract it from this number, you have $270,000 of equity in your home. It's fairly straightforward, right? So remember, the equity is the difference between the value of your home and the amount that you owe on your mortgage. Now, this equity, this belongs to you. It has a monetary value, right? And it needs to be protected in the exact same way that you need to protect any other assets you have. So later on in this lesson, we're actually going to show you a few strategies you can use to protect the equity in your house. Now, switching gears a little bit, we're going to talk about a little bit different subject. There are few things quite as traumatic in life as dealing with the death of a loved one, whether that be a family member, like a parent, a sibling, a spouse, or even a friend, a close family friend. There's few things quite as traumatic as that. However, it is a reality that we're all going to face this at some point in our lives. And in having to deal with that situation, we're also going to have to deal with insurance companies. We're going to have to deal with locating and reading the will, and then coming up with a fair process to divide and distribute assets. You know, it can be draining, but it is a necessary process that we have to handle. And then we have to add in, money, assets, investments, and in unfortunate cases, there are, contentious family members. It's no wonder why most people want to avoid these types of situations and think they can get overwhelmed by this life event. That's totally understandable. I get that. But what exactly is probate, this word over here? What is that? So if a person dies owning property, the question arises, who would be the next rightful owner of that property, right? So probate is the procedure by which the ownership would be determined. So essentially, probate is the process by which a court distributes your estate after you pass away. So if you've prepared a will, the court will distribute according to that document. It sounds simple, right? Unfortunately, it's rarely that easy because most people haven't actually written a will. So when someone dies without leaving a will behind, that person is said to have died intestate, and an appointed administrator would then decide who would inherit what. And don't assume for a second that your spouse or your children will automatically just get everything and get their equal share of it. Now, besides, you don't even have to be rich to encounter problems like this. Being wealthy, it can add complications, but even average middle-class families are going to have to deal with a number of problems if they don't plan ahead of time and prepare correctly. Let's take a look at an example, actually, just kind of illustrate this point. This right here, this guy here, his name is Joe. Now, Joe has been happily married for 10 years to his wife here, and they have 2 children, cat, dog, just your regular American family, right? He works out as a branch manager at a bank. Now, Joe and his family, they have a pretty nice house with a decent amount of equity in it. You can see just money is just spilling out of Joe's home. Now, unfortunately, Joe has to have a surgery, and he ends up passing away from surgery complications. So bye-bye, Joe. Now, his widow and his kids, they're fully expecting to inherit his entire property. Now, however, due to state statute that they live in, Joe, he had kids from a previous marriage, and they're also eligible to inherit their share of Joe's estate. Now, because Joe didn't leave any will or trust behind, or leave any will behind, his estate went into, you guessed it, the probate process. And it took 2 years to complete, and it cost almost 1/3 of his whole estate. Now, I want you to remember, the procedure of probate itself is not the most expensive part. It's the professional fees that are charged by the attorneys that are entitled to be compensated for their work on behalf of the estate. That's where you're going to be getting the most expense from. Often, those fees can reach several hundreds of dollars per hour. And so as a result, Joe's family not only lost their beloved husband and father, but they also lost lots of money and time, not to mention the emotional distress that they experienced during this whole process. Now, had Joe left a will behind before he passed away, all of this emotional distress could have been avoided. Let's take a look at another example. This is Diego's story. So Diego, he passes away without a will and his assets go into probate, just like with Joe. Now, while Diego owned his home, his family home, he also owed $27,000 on his mortgage. And he also had some tax debts left behind, almost $3,200. Now, with no cash or other liquid assets to pay Diego's debt, the judge who's going over his estate, he orders Diego's son, Juan, who was named the administrator of Diego's estate, he has to be ordered to sell the family home in order to cover these debts. Now, again, just like with Joe's example, if Diego had planned ahead of time and put a will in place to make sure to be able to take care of these debts he left behind, his family may have been able to keep their beloved family home. And unfortunately, because he didn't, not only were they put in some financial stress, but also some emotional stress as well. And so if we can avoid that, because if you pass, there's going to be emotional ramifications of that. That can't be avoided, especially, obviously if your family cares about you. But what can be avoided is additional financial strain. If we can avoid that, we want to do that. Anybody would want to do that, right? Now, as far as fees go, California has simplified procedures for transferring property when an estate is worth $150,000 or less. So simplified probate cost is from $20,000 to $150,000, depending on the circumstances and the kind of property. So anyone who has real estate in California most likely isn't going to fit into this. I mean, we all know California is one of the most expensive states to live in. Now, in full formal probates, the cost may reach up to the full estate cost in the worst case scenario. Now, in addition, when determining the cost of probate, it's very important to remember that debts are not included in determining attorney's fees. So if a house has a fair market value of $600,000, but it has a mortgage, for example, of $300,000, it's going to be considered an asset with a value of $600,000. That mortgage isn't going to subtract from the value of the home in the purpose of calculating attorney's fees. So you have to remember that. Now, because of this, that means the chances are going to increase that your spouse or your children could be forced to sell or borrow against the family home in order to satisfy the probate fees, if they're subject to that. So there are certain assets that are going to be subject to probate and certain assets that are not going to be subject to probate. There is a difference between the two. Now, in order to kind of go over what the differences is, it's always easier to kind of define the non-probate pot. So why don't we start there? So non-probate assets, they have something called a survivorship feature or a designated beneficiary. So these assets are those that do not pass under the terms of a will. So examples of this would be, say you have a jointly owned piece of real estate. Like say, for example, you live in your house with your significant other, your spouse, and they have rights of survivorship to that property. Same thing with bank accounts that are listed as payable on death. If you have a designated beneficiary for things like that. It also applies to irrevocable living trust, life insurance policies that have a beneficiary named. Same with 401ks, annuities, assets, those like that. These are the kind of assets that are not going to be subject to probate. Now, on the inverse of that, assets that will be subject to probate aren't going to have that survivorship feature, right? Those are the kind of things that will pass under the terms of a will. So if you have personal property like jewelry, furniture, car, a bank account that's owned solely by the person who passed, real estate property that's owned solely by the person who passed, right? Those kind of things that don't have a beneficiary designation, these are the kind of things that will be subject to probate. So that's a pretty easy way to kind of remember, what will be in probate and what won't. If it has a survivorship feature, most likely you're going to be saved. If it does not, it's going to be subject to probate. So let's keep that in mind. So how do we know whether a will is valid and it will be accepted by the probate court? Now, there are a few reasons that a will could be contested and in some cases thrown out. Say, for example, let's use another example. This is our friend Robert here. Now, Robert is 79 years old and he decides he wants to prepare his will. Now, he's been under the care of a doctor for the dementia he's suffering, and he has he's needed 24-hour care. Now, Robert's son, Rodney, he's insisted that his father prepare a will, and he calls his attorney friend to help him do that. Now, in the will, all the property that Robert has is going to be left to Rodney, while the other siblings will be excluded. Now, given Robert's mental state, it's going to be unlikely that he possessed the competency needed to prepare that will, and this was rejected, or this is why that will was rejected by the court. So it means that if the deceased person had a will, but was not mentally competent when he or she made up that will, then their decisions are subject to be questioned, right? So you have things like dementia, insanity, being under the influence of a substance. All of these situations and more, obviously, might be subject or might be a reason to reject a will that's in place and still go through with the probate process. Now, another reason you have down here is something called undue influence, or in layman's terms, lack of free will. What this means is that in this case, someone manipulated a vulnerable person into leaving much or all of their property to the manipulator. This is much like our case here with Robert and Rodney. Another reason to contest a will would be that if it was not the last will written and there is a more recent will that was either lost or destroyed, then you could also contest the will as well. And then last but not least, a will could be contested if it was not properly prepared, signed, or witnessed, right? Now, another little caveat in probate. Now, if you were to pass away suddenly, what would happen to your children? This is a scenario that no parent wants to think about, but preparing for it could spare your family a great deal of delay, expense, and even conflict. Now, if one parent dies, then usually the surviving parent will retain sole custody of any children they had between them. Only in special cases will this not be the case. However, if both parents pass away, it's important to have an estate plan in place that names a legal guardian to care for the minor child. So while naming a legal guardian is probably one of the hardest decisions that a parent has to make, failure to do so can have devastating consequences and have the child possibly end up as a ward of the state. And that's a situation that everybody wants to avoid. So why should you avoid probate? Well, two of the main reasons would be the time and the cost it takes to complete the process. Remember, the probate is a court process, and along with the various proceedings and hearings, simply gathering assets and paying off debts can take months or even years in some cases. And also, we can't forget, sometimes there are family squabbles, that's just a reality of the situation. So many families have been torn apart by the arguments that can erupt after the death of a family member, especially in the case of blended families. Also, if you have not made a will and you're still legally married, even if you're separated, your spouse could inherit all of your estate, or part of it at least. So as you can see, when it comes to financial matters, most problems and difficulties can be avoided with proper planning and proper preparation. So the key is to sit down, analyze the situation, and then make and execute a plan. So dealing with the idea of passing on is never easy. It's not a fun subject, but facing those decisions now will make it much less emotionally traumatic for your family and your heirs later on. Now, will and trust. Most people have heard these terms before, will and trust, but they may not know what the difference is between those two documents. So let's get into it. Let's start up here. A will is a document that directs who will receive your property after your death, and it also appoints a legal representative to carry out your wishes. So a will is only going to go into effect after you pass away. Now, a trust is a legal arrangement through which one person or institution, they would be called a trustee, holds legal title to the property for another person. That person would be the beneficiary. Now, in contrast to a will, a trust can begin the distribution of property before a death or after. So everyone who has children or assets of any kind should have both a will and a trust in place. So if a child loses his or her parents and no directive for that child's well-being is in place, the child can become a ward of the court and be placed in foster care until a relative steps up to take responsibility for that child. So that can be a long and drawn-out process. It can create fear and uncertainty with that child. Similarly with assets, if there's no directive in place, those assets will go through probate and can be dramatically reduced with legal fees and taxes, just because these documents weren't already put in place. So what are the requirements for a valid will? Now, the requirements are going to vary from state to state, honestly. But what makes a will legal and approved by the court? Now, most states are going to require that a will be dated and a signature be properly witnessed. Now, wills are usually signed with, pen and ink, but electronic signatures are becoming more and more common. Everything is becoming more electronic as we go on. That's the beauty of technology, right? Also, at least 2 adult witnesses should be present and sign that to verify that the will was properly prepared. Now, it's important to remember spouses or heirs cannot be the witness, since their right to inherit could be forfeited later on, right? So keep that in mind. You want to remember that. Now, some states will make an exception and consider signed wills without witnesses to be legally valid. Those are going to be called holographic wills, okay? Now, in order for a holographic will to be valid, it has to have 4 criteria. 1, it must be fully handwritten. 2, it indicates the intent to make a will. 3, it clearly describes the property and identifies the beneficiaries. And then 4, last but not least, it must be signed by the person who wrote the will. You're going to need all 4 of those in order to make a holographic will, okay? Now, having a legal document that details what should happen to your assets is a vital part of estate planning. Now, the only way to make sure that your final wishes are met is to create something called a living trust, okay? So let's pretend you own an investment property, right? So if you have a living trust, what you could do is you could take the deed of that property, you could scratch your name off and put it in the name of the trust. Now, from that point on, you would no longer own that property anymore. The living trust would own the property, and you would become what would be called the grantor of that trust. Now, you can do the same thing with any other asset you have, right? This process is called funding the trust, and all those items put together, is called a trust fund. I'm sure you've heard of that term before. Now, the next step would be that you, as the grantor, you would choose who is responsible for that trust. That person is the trustee. So the trustee acts as the legal owner of the trust, right? And they are responsible for handling any of the assets in that trust. Now, from that trust fund, a grantor, they can leave a full inheritance to their heirs, sometimes with certain conditions put in place, something like, say, for example, if they had a grandchild who had to finish college first before they could have access to their trust fund. You can do something like that. So how is a living trust different from a will? Now, a living trust does not go through probate, right? Which often means that there's going to be a faster distribution of assets to your heirs, while a will would still go through that formal probate procedure, and it's going to take more time. It's going to be a longer process. Also, a living trust is a private document, right? A will, on the other hand, is public record, and so all the transactions in a will would be public as well. Now, incapacitation planning is also an important reason to have a living trust. So, something like a tragic car accident, a debilitating illness, or even a work-related injury could all result in your incapacitation. So incapacitation planning may even be more important than planning for your eventual death. Worse still, your family and loved ones may end up in a contentious and divisive court battle over the right to control your assets and/or make healthcare decisions for you. Now, a trust can be either revocable or it can be irrevocable. Now, a revocable trust can be changed or revoked at any time. And this is the most common type of trust here, the most common type of living trust. Now, an irrevocable living trust is active and it cannot be changed even by the grantor, right? It would only take a judge, or only a judge could decide whether a change could be made. And even then, the circumstances would have to be pretty special for them to grant that. Let's take a look at a few real-life examples of people who passed away without a will or trust. Now, you saw this gentleman's picture a little bit earlier in our presentation. This is Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix, one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. He passed away in 1970. Now, the battle over his estate, it raged over 30 years purely because Jimmy left no will when he passed away. Down here, this is a gentleman named Sonny Bono. You guys heard of Sonny and Cher, right? Right. This is the guy. This is Sonny and Cher. Now, Sonny Bono passed away after his music career. He'd become a politician. I don't know. I didn't actually know that before I put together this presentation. But he passed away in a skiing accident in 1998. But he died as well with no will in place. And because of that, his widow, Mary Bono, rather than staying at home and being able to grieve her husband, she had to go to court in order to claim his estate. Now, things got a little bit complicated when his ex-wife, Cher, Sonny's ex-wife, Cher, showed up, and she claimed part of his estate as well. Not just that, he also had a love child showed up, and they also made their claim on his estate. So it just got really messy and really drawn out, and all of it could have been avoided if he'd had a few simple documents in place. This gentleman up here, his name is Stieg Larsson. Stieg Larsson was an author who passed away in 2004. He actually wrote a book called The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. It was made into a pretty successful movie not too long ago. It's pretty good. You should check it out. Now, this gentleman, he also died without a will in place, and since he was Swedish law dictated at the time that his estate was going to be divided between his father and his brother. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, it doesn't sound too bad until I mentioned that Stieg's lifelong partner of 30 years received nothing when he passed away. They spent 32 years together and she didn't get anything except for the apartment that they shared together. And the only reason she got that is because Larsson's father and brother decided to be generous and give it to her, right? I don't know how happy he would have been about that. This gentleman down here is Howard Hughes. His name might sound familiar to you because Leonardo DiCaprio played him in a movie called The Aviator. I'm sure you probably heard of that. It was a good movie. Right now, he passed away in 1976. He was 70 years old. And actually, a will was actually found. It was discovered at the headquarters of a Mormon church, right, in Salt Lake City. Now, unfortunately, this will was eventually discovered to be a forgery, and his estate ended up having to be divided among his 22 cousins that he left behind. That didn't turn out too well. This gentleman here is Prince. Prince died in 2016, and he left an estate of over $200 million. Now, just like with all the other scenarios, he left no will and no trust in place, and it's been 4 years since he passed, and the battle is still going on over his estate to this very day. And the same is said for our Queen of Soul over here, Aretha Franklin. So I want you to understand just how critical it is to have a will and living trust, irrespective of how old you are and how many assets you have. I mean, Jimi Hendrix over here, when he passed away, he was only 27, right? So it doesn't matter how old you are. If you don't have these two critical documents, your family could lose a significant amount of everything that you work so hard for in the case that something happens to you. And if we can avoid that scenario, wouldn't we want to do that? Of course we would want to do that, right? Now let's switch gears a little bit and we talk about a different kind of life scenario. And we're going to talk about something called an advanced directive. All right. So let's imagine a married man in his 40s. This guy here, his name is Sam. Sam lives a simple life. You know, he's frugal. He likes to live in the country. He has his horses, his chickens, you know, his little farm. Everything is good for Sam. All is good until one day Sam suffers a stroke due to his long-lasting high blood pressure problem. And unfortunately, this is going to lead to Sam being incapacitated. Now, Sam has lost his ability to talk, to write, express himself, share his wishes, all of that stuff. Now, while he's in the medical center, you know, at some point his doctors are going to face a dilemma in regards to his medical treatment. You know, what if Sam's heart stops beating? Should they use CPR to revive him? You know, what kind of comfort care does Sam need? Does he need to be fed through a tube? Anything like that? What else does he need as far as his comfort goes? Now, all of these procedures are going to cost hundreds or thousands of dollars to his family. You know, we all know how expensive medicine is nowadays. Now, did Sam have any thoughts about being a tissue donor? Was he for or against that? You know, would he want to be kept on life support, right? If he can, you know, breathe on his own. And who should be able to decide the answers to all of these questions? Should it be the doctors? Are they empowered to decide these kind of decisions? Or should it be Sam's wife and his family, his kids, all that kind of stuff? Who should be able to make these decisions? Now, all these questions arise because the only person who would have been able to decide about all these things was Sam. But how can he tell you what he wants? How can he tell the doctors or his family what he wants if he can't speak anymore? Well, he can't make that decision now. Unfortunately, it's a little too late, but he could have made that decision before he had his stroke. And if he had put together a simple document called an advanced directive, that would have solved all of the problems highlighted in this situation. It takes 10 minutes to fill out an advanced directive and forget about it for the rest of your life, unless and until you decide to make changes, of course. So if a situation like this were to ever happen, everyone involved, the doctors, family members, would know exactly what Sam's wishes would have been. So make sure if you ever find yourself in Sam's situation that you don't end up like Sam and you actually have all of your wishes written out in that advanced directive so there's no guesswork involved. So this scenario actually isn't made up. You know, it actually happens quite frequently in everyday life and can quite often wipe out everything that a person was working hard for to leave behind to their devastated family. In fact, I'll show you a real life scenario where this actually happened. This lady right here, her name was Terry Schiavo. Now, Terry Schiavo was a young woman from Pennsylvania who collapsed in her hallway in her apartment in 1990 when she was 26 years old. She suffered a cardiac arrest and she eventually went into a persistent vegetative state. Now, she was kept alive on life support, and her husband was appointed as a legal guardian should she was no longer capable of making her own decisions. Now, in 1998, after 8 years, her husband filed a petition with the court asking to disconnect Terry's feeding tube. Now, Terry's parents opposed this decision. Now, because Terry didn't have an advanced directive in place and she hadn't appointed someone to make those kind of decisions for her, an epic legal battle ensued that ripped apart her family. You know, it involved 14 appeals, numerous motions, petitions, hearings, political intervention. You know, this went all the way from the state legislature to the governor to Congress. It even ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, the courts ordered the removal of her feeding tube 3 times between 2001 and 2005. Now, eventually, Terry finally passed away in March of 2005. All of this heartache could have been avoided if that simple advanced directive had been filled out for Terry, or she'd filled it out before she suffered her incapacitation. So advanced directive aren't just for older adults. Remember, Terry was only 26 when she suffered her cardiac arrest. Unexpected end-of-life situations can happen at any age, so it's important for all adults to prepare these kind of documents. So I hope you understand just how important this document is and the critical roles it plays for your family and for their emotional well-being. Now, medical or healthcare power of attorney is a type of advance directive in which you name a person to make decisions for you when you are unable to do so for yourself. So it may be someone close in your life. It could be a spouse or a friend, another family member, anything like that. It's up to you. Now, while in a living will, you can cover some basic and most obvious wishes and preferences. The power of an attorney allows someone who is acting in your best interest to make instant decisions based on a rapidly changing situation, like when a medical emergency is present. Now, both a living will and a power of attorney, it can provide clear guidance to healthcare providers and reduce the likelihood of a dispute with and among family members, and ensure that you avoid all unwanted procedures and that all your wishes are carried out the way you would want them to be. Now, all of the above here are problems that we've learned about so far. We know that probate, it can cost a lot of time and money to your family. A trust, it eliminates probate and saves your family a lot of money. Advance directives, make sure your wishes are known if you can't speak for yourself. Power of attorney, which indicates, who can make decisions for you if you can't. And then obviously, we have wills up here. Collectively, all of these put together is something called estate planning. And usually it can come as a package, right? So you're going to need to have all of these. You're going to need all of this stuff. And you can get all of them at one time. Now, what you can do is you could Google and find an estate attorney in your area, sign up for a consultation and get an estate planning package. Usually that can come anywhere in a range between $2,000 to $5,000, depending on where you live. Now, attorneys, they're going to be friendly and they're going to want to get personal with you so that they can fully understand your unique situation and provide all the relevant information to and advice that would help you fit your best interests, right? However, I want you to keep in mind that if you do need to make any changes in the future, like say, for example, you decide you want to change your will or decide assign a different person to make decisions for you in your power of attorney, something like that, you're going to need to pay attorney fees every time you need to make those changes if this is the avenue you take. Now, on the flip side of that, we've noticed that, younger, more tech-savvy people, usually they prefer to do kind of things like this themselves. Now, you can get this entire package over here for about $500 and never pay the attorney's fees if you need to change anything. You'd be able to, log into your account and then make that change yourself. So I recommend the online version if you have like a simple situation, if you don't have a bunch of complex assets and all that kind of stuff, and you can do it yourself here for a fraction of the cost. However, if you have more of a complex situation, you have a lot of kind of things going on, I would say this might be the best option for you. Again, everything we talk about here in all our lessons is based on your situation, and we don't want to give any blanket advice. You have to know what's right for your unique situation. Now, as your wealth grows, you're going to need to protect yourself from unforeseen risk that grows with it. Learning the best ways to manage the risk and ensure yourself from potential loss is extremely important. Frivolous lawsuits and unscrupulous business practices have stolen many a person's fortune and life savings, right? See, creditor, he wants you to give you money. Now, there are many situations where your assets can be seized or garnished. Situation like filing for bankruptcy, divorce, or being on the losing end of a civil lawsuit. All these kind of things could be reasons why you have certain assets garnished or seized. Now, federal law prevents judgment creditors from going after money in a pension plan that was set up under the Employee Retirement Income Securities Act, or ERISA for short here. Now, to be protected against creditors, your account must be either a qualified retirement plan or an employee welfare benefit plan covered by ERISA. So examples of these type of accounts would be, or protected plans would be, 401ks, pension plans, group health plans, life insurance plans, dental and vision plans, all these kind of things here, right? Now, there are certain circumstances where a judgment creditor may be able to get a hold of your ERISA account. Situations such as if there was a domestic relation order for a spousal or child support, or there was an IRS tax garnishment, something like that. Then you might possibly have these be subject to a judgment creditor. Now, if you have an account or a retirement account that is not qualified or covered under ERISA, then a judgment creditor could potentially seize it. These are going to be things like IRAs, Roth IRAs, simple IRAs, 403Bs, employer-only plans, things like that, or employer-only plans. These are the kind of things that don't benefit employees. That's basically what that means. These are the kind that are going to be subject to seizure in those kind of situations we talked about a little bit earlier. So it's important to keep that in mind, just to see what you have and see what could be subject to seizure. Right. Now, your home is also another asset that could be vulnerable to seizure. Now, homestead generally refers to the primary residence owned and occupied by a person or family. So a homestead exemption is a legal provision designed to protect the value in a principal dwelling home, right? So homestead exemptions can provide asset protection from creditors for at least some of the value of the home. So a homestead exemption the amounts vary from state to state and are sometimes different based on whether a single person or a couple is filing for the exemption. So for example, the homestead exemption for a single person in California would be $75,000. That would go up to $100,000 if it was a married couple or joint owner in that situation. In Illinois, it's $15,000 for a single person and $30,000 for a married couple or joint owner. Can't speak today. Now, the difference here is Arizona is a different kind of state where their homestead exemption is the same whether you're single or a couple. It doesn't change. It stays at $150,000 in both cases. So what would this look like in a practical example? Let's take a look at this. So do you remember our friend here, Mr. Jones? We've met him in a few previous lessons. He's not the best with money, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll see how he does here. Now, Mr. Jones and his family, they live in a pretty nice house, right? It's a nice house that they've managed to build up a decent amount of equity in. He has about $500,000. Now, unfortunately, one day, Mr. Jones gets in a car accident. Uh-oh, that's not good. Now, this car accident leads to Mr. Jones being sued. Now, he gets sued and unfortunately he loses his case and a judgment is ruled against him for, ouch, $1 million. Poor Mr. Jones. Now, the first thing that judgment creditor is going to look at is how much car insurance Mr. Jones has. So they're going to take a look at his policy. And in his case, Mr. Jones's policy is maxed out at $300,000. So first thing they're going to do is max that out. Now, that's obviously not going to cover the full amount of this judgment here. So next, the next thing up for grabs are Mr. Jones's assets. And obviously one of the first big ones to go after is his equity-filled house. Now, because Mr. Jones is married and he lives in California, he can claim that homestead exemption. Remember, it's $100,000. But that still means, you see, he has $500,000 in equity. So $100,000 of that is protected, but that means that the other $400,000 of his equity can be taken by that creditor. Now, unfortunately, still, this is not the end of Mr. Jones's woes because he still owes, after paying $300,000 and then $400,000 of his equity, he still owes $300,000. And so they're going to keep coming after more of his assets until this full $1 million settlement is paid. So basically, Mr. Jones is up a creek right now. But what avenues could he have taken to avoid having himself and his family in that situation? Now, one of the first steps he could have done was to have a substantial umbrella insurance policy. Now, umbrella insurance is a type of personal liability coverage that covers claims that are in excess of regular homeowners, auto, or watercraft policy coverage. Now, umbrella insurance covers not only just the policyholder, but also other members of the family or household. So say, for example, it had been Mr. Jones's daughter who got in that car accident. She would be covered under umbrella insurance. Now, that being said, make sure if you decide that this is an avenue you want to take, make sure you understand how your specific policy defines a household member so that you'll actually have the coverage that you need. Now, umbrella insurance, it's also important to note, it covers injury to others or damage to their possessions. It does not protect the policy owner's property. So in this case, in our example, it wouldn't have protected Mr. Jones's car. In this case, he would have needed his car insurance to take care of that, right? So this goes on top of the car insurance, right? Now, an LLC is another strategy that you can use that protects you and your personal assets, things including your car, your home, or your bank accounts, from liability if your business is ever sued or incurs debts. So in our example, what if we said that the car Mr. Jones was driving had been his business vehicle and he was in that accident while he was on his way to work? Now, if his work vehicle was listed as an asset under his LLC, then that judgment creditor would only be able to sue for assets also listed under the LLC. All of Mr. Jones's personal assets, including his equity-filled house, would have been protected. Now, if he had been a sole proprietor, he wouldn't have had this protection. Now, the requirements for forming an LLC, they're going to differ from state to state. So again, if you think this might be a viable option for you, you'd want to check with your state to see what steps would need to be taken in your situation in order to create this kind of entity. Equity management. Equity management, this is the process of reducing the equity value of a real estate asset. This is one of the oldest asset protection strategies out there. Now, essentially, what it does is it entails encumbering a property with debt to such an extent that there's little or no equity for creditors to acquire. So by giving another party or a claim against the property, owners retain control over the cash flows and use of that asset. Now, while making the property unattractive to those trying to perfect any type of judgment claim against it. Now, although this is a seemingly straightforward approach, there are going to be certain requirements that must be met in order to ensure its effectiveness. So various ways of executing this strategy provide increasing level of benefit to the owner. Now, another similar tactic you could use in this same arena would be to shift the title of a property into the name of a debtor's spouse. Now, this method allows the debtor to file what's called a quitclaim in the name of their spouse. This would be done in the case that the spouse has little or no debt to their name. It wouldn't be effective if they had a bunch of debt in their name as well. Now, this is something over here. This is called a HELOC. A HELOC is a home equity line of credit. It's a revolving line of credit, usually with an adjustable interest rate, which allows you to borrow up to a certain amount of money over a period of time. Now, HELOCs work in a manner similar to credit cards, where you can continuously borrow up to an approved limit while paying off the balance. Now, a homeowner can leverage their home equity in the form of collateral to either secure a home equity loan, a traditional HELOC, or a fixed rate HELOC. Now, it's also important to remember a larger down payment, say over 20% for an example, that's going to automatically give the homeowner more equity than a smaller down payment would. That seems, this is fairly straightforward. Now, a HELOC is also a great tool to use with equity management because by borrowing against a home's equity, the homeowner reduces their own equitable interest in it. So if a creditor did come knocking, that homeowner's house wouldn't look like an attractive asset to go after. In fact, our founder, Wallio's founder, Ramon, he actually uses that strategy himself in order to protect his own family home. Now, it should also be noted that wealthy people use this strategy not only as a form of protection, but also as a form of investment. By constantly refinancing and pulling out equity out of their homes, that equity can then be reinvested in other, more safer vehicles. Now, however, if you're the average Joe, I want you to remember, don't try that tactic by yourself on at home. You'd want to have a qualified investment professional advise you on what would be the best way to proceed with something like that. That's not something you should want to do by yourself. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning of our lesson. I was going to tell you a story of two brothers, and now we're here. So what this story is going to illustrate is it's a comparison between old mortgage concepts and new ones. So brother A over here, he follows the more traditional teachings of paying off your mortgage as fast as humanly possible, while brother B, he decides that, times have changed and he wants to, have more options for his money. So as you can see here in this first slide, the brothers have taken starkly different approaches when it comes to home ownership. But which one's right? Let's see how this works out. Okay, so after just 5 years, you can see that brother A has less tax savings and he has $0 in his investment accounts. So what if this was, current day and both brothers had lost their jobs due to the COVID pandemic? As you can see, brother A has no savings for the crisis, while brother B has over $83,000 to help him and his family get through these trying times. So brother A also wouldn't be able to access the equity in his home due to his job loss, and he would face foreclosure or at the very least forbearance with his home. Now, if this was up to you, which brother would you rather be? Sounds like a rhetorical question, right? But, maybe everything turns out fine. Let's keep going and see how it goes. So let's say that there's no financial crisis that happens in 15 years. Now, brother A, he's completed his plan and he owns his home now. He has $25,000 in tax savings and now over $600,000 in savings and investments. See, it's not bad. He's doing pretty good, right? I think a lot of people would be happy with that. So how about brother B? Now, over 15 years of knowing that cash is king and it's always better to have options when you need them the most, brother B has received over $67,000 in tax savings, which is more than double than his brother over here, brother A. He also has over $1.1 million in savings and investments, and he owns his home outright as well. So who made the right decision? So why do most people follow the traditional investment plans? Answer simple. It's what their parents did. And plus, it's also what the banks want you to do. Now, most people just do what everyone else is doing, thinking that that has to be the right path, right? It's understandable. Now, as you can see, though, being financially educated can be extremely empowering and profitable. So keeping an open mind and having a desire to be in control of your finances will help you develop the knowledge and a certainty for a brighter future. Now, we spend our lives working to provide for ourselves and our families. Setting aside some of your income to prepare for the day when you can slow down a little bit and maybe start doing some of the things that inspire you, if that's what you want to do. Protecting your nest egg as you grow older is an important part of the puzzle of retirement, right? So actually, one of the biggest concerns of the baby boomer generation is not having enough money as they get older and then eventually becoming a financial burden on their families. So what do we need to prepare for? A few things to consider would be, maintaining your health. Medical costs are just one of the biggest drains on retirement savings. So a little daily exercise and eating healthier foods can actually end up saving you a lot of retirement dollars in the long run. Moving your investment dollars to more conservative accounts so that you don't have to worry about the volatility of the markets. And, especially in 2020, we've had a crazy year as far as the markets are concerned. Putting your putting some protection on your retirement plans with fixed and index programs that are offered by insurance companies. That's another avenue you could take. Protecting yourself from future tax increases by the government with tax advantage investments. Utilize some of the strategies that we've shared with you in this lesson on trusts and equity protection. The best protection you can ever have is knowledge, right? Learning is a lifelong journey and it prepares you for the future that you deserve. So that's going to conclude this week's lesson. You know, most people don't plan to fail, but they unfortunately do fail to plan. So there are a lot of things that we've gone over in the lesson this week that I understand they're not really pleasant subjects to think about. I totally hear you. However, putting certain plans in place ahead of time can save your family a ton of unnecessary headache and heartache in the future. You know, sometimes that can be one of the best ways that we can actually show our loved ones how much we cared before we passed on. Now, our next lesson, lesson 9, is going to be all about retirement income. Now, everybody wants to retire at some point, right? I know I do. So I know you're going to get a lot of great information with that lesson. And also next week, you're going to be introduced to our wonderful retirement expert. His name is Bill Quinn. And so I'm really excited for all of you to meet him because he is a wealth of knowledge and he's absolutely the perfect person who's going to be teaching you next week's lesson. So please come back next week for that. So without further ado, I'll leave you with one of our signature memes. Fun stuff. It's too late for this guy. So again, my name's Jordan Fuller. I'm so glad I got to spend these last 4 lessons with you. I want you to have a great rest of your week. Please stay safe and stay healthy. And we look forward to seeing you for the rest of this boot camp. You all have a great rest of your night. Take care. Bye-bye.